Chapter 21, Part 4. So we were looking at Cubism, and we have Picasso and Braque are our main two Cubists. Okay, now we're going to get into the Futurists. Now, a lot of these isms get aligned with political movements. Cubism, of course, was um, arguing against the distortion and noise of what's going on in the world. It has to do with Einstein's theories, but it's also about the Industrial Revolution, and it's against mechanization, and it's also on the right side of politics when we get into Guernica, which is a little bit later. Then we see Picasso do an anti-fascist piece. Okay, he's fighting against the dictatorship of Franco. Franco does end up winning, even though in World War II, it's pre-World War II, Spanish Civil War. But the way it plays out for Spain is that the fascist stays in power. The rest of Europe goes toward more of a democratic way, and then Eastern Europe, of course, goes toward communism. But the fascists, one of the reasons they gain power is because everybody's anti-communist. And we're going to look at the Futurists, which were actually Italian, and they were pro-Mussolini and pro-fascism. And so in some ways they fell out of the textbook a little bit, but we still look at them regardless of the fact that they were for fascism. And we're going to look at Dadaism, which is against. So motion is important to the Futurists, and they think it's the glory of the 20th century, and they think that all these inventions and the Industrial Revolution are just great. Boccioni is one of the first, and we see this very strange looking abstract sculpture, but what it is it's all these multiple planes in one space. So it's the motion sort of captured. How do you want to say? So I'm going to read from the book again on this one, page 491. On this particular piece, he says it represents a striding human figure as the futurists imagined to be in the light of contemporary science, the field of energy interacting with everything around it. Sculpture, says Boccioni, must give life to objects by making their extension in space palpable, systematic, and plastic, since no one can any longer believe that an object ends where another begins, and that our body is surrounded by anything that does not cut through it and section it in an arabesque of directional curves. So that's a quote from Boccioni himself inside of our textbook on 491. So it's a quote within a quote. So he believes in all these motion pieces being defined at once. Again, we're dealing a little bit of another permutation of Einstein's theories. That's taking hold, and some interesting concepts about how we're interacting with space. Okay, so Dadaism, it's a protest movement, and it's anti everything, basically. But after World War I, and don't get confused, World War I is the first air war with air battles. And it was totally shocking. There were horses that had heart attacks in the field, plowing the fields in Germany and so on. Seeing a plane, they thought it was a giant bird and had heart attack, it just died in the field. Planes had never really been seen in a general way. They were developing, of course, flight was developing in the 20th century, but once World War I arrives, 1914 to 1918, we're starting to bomb people from the air. So that became a huge big deal, and of course, Cubism is one way that Picasso protests this. With Guernica, they bomb a town and just try out their aeronautical supremacy. The Nazis do. But Dada is protesting in general to the sense of mechanization of war. And there was gas, there was mustard gas used. It just sort of invaded. It wasn't anymore like hand-to-hand combat. There was that, but there's all this technology happening in war. Devastating effect. More and more people are dying. There's a lot of noise going on, and a lot of things are being produced at this point, and we're starting to get into consumerism and throwing away things and just piles of debris. We also have newspapers. They're getting printed several times a day and stacks of newspapers and so on. So we'll get into ready-mades with Duchamp as well. He's also another Dadaist. But first we're going to look at Hannah Hawk, Cut with a Kitchen Knife. This is a longer title. So look at this one carefully, and it's a really tremendous piece earlier in photography in that chapter. So this has a big visual shift for types of imagery, very chaotic. I mean, we did see that in Cubism. We do see some different chaotic compositions, but now we're really responding to mechanization. So if we see, in the World War I, we see these gears happening, we see all this stuff happening. She's cutting all these images out of newspapers, which are thrown away, and the text and so on. And she's talking here about the rise of the Industrial Revolution, the noise, the churning out of products, and she's also talking about the anti-Dadaists over here, the rise of, if you can kind of see that iron cross there, the rise of the German Republic, Kaiser, and I'm forgetting who, I think that's Kaiser Wilhelm there. So a bunch of anti-Dadaists that are pushing for militarization and fascism, because after World War I, Hitler gets some footing, and he is around for a long time. I know we think about him only in the 40s, but he starts out in the late teens and early 20s, gaining power and momentum. He takes a long time to build up to where he is. But there's a lot of other things happening. Here we have Stalin over here and Einstein in our Dadaist area. Einstein is highly regarded. And then we have some artists, and I believe that's the self-portrait of her there. But you can just see there's a lot of things going on here, a lot of cutting and pasting. So she's really protesting the mechanization of war here in 1919, right after World War I. Duchamp, oh my goodness, image 21.21 on page 493. This is the beginning of ready-mades and the beginning of a number of styles and isms and other forms of art that he influences. Duchamp is in 1917, think about that, 100 years ago, he is the father of conceptual art, of kinetic art, and ready-mades or found object art. So this is one of his found objects, which is literally a urinal. He yanks it out from somewhere, I don't exactly know where, or maybe they're remodeling and he just grabs it. And then he signs his name on it, 1917, and he puts it in the gallery. He puts it in, and there's just shock and awe. Oh my God! How dare you put this in to, I believe it was the Armory show in 1917, and this is a replica. So kind of what happens with some of his work is that a repair person or a maintenance person will see his works in the storage area of a museum, and they'll check it because it just looks like a toilet. So that did happen, and in 1964 they found another one of the same model because it was well documented. There's many photographs of this from that time, from 1917. So he's upturning, he's literally peeing on the establishment. He's like, I say this is art, so therefore it's art, and that's somewhat to do with appropriation as well. He's just decided to turn the art world on its head and take objects that exist, manufactured objects primarily, and recontextualize them. That's another good word to know in the modern era and postmodern. He recontextualizes it in the museum. Voila, art. Okay, so then we're going to get into surrealists. Now, some things will say that Duchamp is a surrealist. He is not. He influences surrealism. And they kind of borrow him, but he's not part of it. He's a Dadaist, okay? So, and he tries to be a Cubist, too. We don't see that in this chapter, but he tries to be a Cubist. Picasso's not having it. He doesn't like his version of Cubism, kicks him out. All right, so a lot of things going on. Surrealism, now we get into Freud, heavy-duty Freud, okay? So, Cubism, I don't want to muddy the field. So surrealism is Sigmund Freud, and they're thinking about dream logic, how strange, bizarre things kind of come together in your mind, and really the word juxtapose, we see it here, the idea of juxtapositioning objects that don't normally go together, that creates strangeness or disorientation. There's a magazine, a very important art magazine now, and it started, I want to say in the 90s. I can't remember. Yeah, it did. So Robert Williams and a few other people, Greg Escalante and one other gentleman I'm forgetting, make a magazine in 1990 called Juxtapose that deals with what is now called pop surrealism in the 21st century, late 20th, so 100 years later, there still is surrealism, but it's different. Anyway, these are our initial figures. Dali, we know who he is already because he's so popular, Magritte and Miro, and you may have heard of these as well. The poetic object is what we were talking about juxtaposing two elements that wouldn't normally go together. First example is Dali, kind of a realistic rendering of objects. He's very detailed. This is not always the style. So we're dealing with, we have a Spaniard here. Dali is from Spain, and we have a shoreline that he may actually have experienced. But this is the persistence of memory. This thing is tiny. It's slightly larger than a piece of paper. Everybody thinks this thing is massive, but it's, I believe, in Boston. It says Museum of Modern Art, but I think it's in Boston, at the Museum of Fine Arts. And we have sort of an eye here with some lashes on it and these clocks that are bent. And that's just a mind bender. But remember, we're talking about a little bit to do with Einstein's theories of time and relativity, how time is bending, and a lot of dream imagery with his ants. And that's another clock, the back of the clock here, and a sleeping figure here. But it's dream imagery, deeply psychological, getting into his psyche, and he gets very into sexual imagery. Dali does, and his sexual frustrations play out in his artwork. Magritte is really well known for these clouds and often showing a sort of a twilight lighted sky in a nighttime scene. Now this one's not a nighttime scene, this is a figurative scene. And notice that these are all fairly realistic figures, right? These forms, but the scale has shifted significantly. We look at this in chapter 5 and look at that. But normally we wouldn't see these bodies put together in this way, and notice he's put some squares nodding to cubism, quite literally, they're cubes, in the sky. So just the unreality of sky, the unreality of the human form, even within reality, if that makes sense. And this lighted candle out on a sort of a balcony here. Another surrealist. Now we're going further into abstraction. So surrealism can look a lot of different ways. Miro's sort of version of this is to use a bunch of colors and shapes and lines and so on. He's kind of in with Kandinsky in terms of the way the composition is and some of the lines, but he's combining strange objects together, like an insect here and perhaps a musical instrument and an enlarged hand. So it's dealing with the shift in scale as we would see in Magritte, and it's dealing with dream imagery and a mixture of things you wouldn't normally find together, but it's highly abstracted, flattened, different take on surrealism. Okay, so the trauma of World War I is something that artists are trying to find a way to show, and then they're also trying to build something out of the destruction, if that makes sense. So constructivism, this is the idea that art should be practiced through architecture, graphic design, theatrical productions, and so on. So if you notice, we're just starting to think about getting away from the big three, painting, architecture, and sculpture, which have held sway on and off since the beginning of the year zero with the Greeks and Romans. So the Renaissance era takes into painting, sculpture, and architecture as these idealistic or these top three art forms, that hierarchy. And now we're starting to break that down a little bit with constructivism, and then when we get into the Bauhaus as well. I'm going to stop here.